Accordia, when we look at Irishness through sport, especially outside of Ireland, the names usually tell us where people's hearts were pointing. And in the last number of episodes, we've looked at that through the lens of the GAA and other sports. Celtic, Hibernian, Shamrocks, St. Patrick's, Saints, Rebels, Patriots, myths and legends. The name usually reaches backwards, across the sea, back to Ireland, back to memory. But let's start off today, Accordia, with something a little bit different. In Vancouver, we get something that's a little bit different to that. The city's best known football team is the Whitecaps. The name kind of first appeared in 1974 with the original NASL team, and it continues all the way through today to modern MLS. It's not an Irish name at all. It's local. The name comes from Vancouver itself, the white-crested waves of the Pacific Ocean and the snow-capped mountains surrounding the city. The story goes that the name came while crossing the Lionsgate Bridge, Whitecaps below, Whitecaps above. Now, technically, what we're talking about here is a franchise, a modern North American model of sport, a team that exists within a league structure tied to ownership, branding, and continuity through business, just to make that little bit of a difference between the identity or the idea of a club in Ireland. But alongside that, in the same city, you get something else. And this is where I want to start today. Because in all of the episodes that I've done focusing on Irishness through clubs, through club identity, the theme has been that the inspiration comes from Ireland. It comes from the Saints, it comes from the Scholars in some cases, it comes from Patriots, or it comes from a place, a tradition, something that's explicitly Irish. But today I'm going to start off the episode with something different, where an Irish club takes inspiration from an existing club or an existing franchise in a city where Irish immigrants go to. And that's why we started with the Whitecaps. Because formed in 2011, so very recent history, we have an example of Irish emigrants or Irish immigrants into Vancouver, into Canada, taking an existing tradition in the form of the Whitecaps and expressing their identity through changing that existing name, kind of paying tribute to it. Because in 2011, a club was formed in Vancouver called the Greencaps. So I love this. They take the traditional existing football team within the city and they add the green to it to represent their own Irishness. In contrast with some of the examples we've looked at in previous episodes, this is a very clear example of the club name being motivated by something that already exists in the society that the emigrants go into. And of course, Accordia, this brings us to Canada, because Irish sport and sporting influences in Canada is not something new. Long before Vancouver Greencaps, long before 2011, long before the modern franchise system, Irish migrants were arriving in huge numbers during and after An Gorta Mór, the Great Hunger. By 1847, tens of thousands were landing in places like Montreal and Toronto, bringing not just themselves, but their language, their identities, and their games. In fact, there are accounts of Irish migrants playing hurling in Canada as early as the 1830s and 1840s, particularly around Montreal. And sometimes they played on ice. What would later be described as ice hurley, a game between memory and adaptation. And some historians suggest that early Canadian hockey may even carry the imprints of these games. More on that later. So today, we're going from the Pacific coast back to famine ships, frozen rivers, shamrocks, saints, the lot of it. The long story of how Irishness learned not just to survive in Canada, but to play in Canada. Accordia, you're listening to Undercover Irish. Fáilte wrote the stock. You're very, very welcome. This is the podcast where we uncover Ireland's hidden curriculum. So Whether you're at home or part of the great diaspora abroad, wherever you are in the world, Carja, sit back, relax, and have a listen to this episode. Eraig ling le céile a carda. Now, Carja, to understand how the Greencaps represents a modern version of identity of Irishness through sport in Canada, we need to go back and see where the shift happens originally, how Irish identity moves from memory to adaptation, and we need to go back to the moment Irish people arrive in Canada in large numbers in the first place. Not in ones or twos or tens, but in their tens of thousands. Because according to the root for most of this goes back to 1845. An Gorta Mór, the Great Hunger, hits Ireland. And by 1847, what's often called Black 47, the crisis at its peak, in that year alone, over 100,000 Irish refugees, immigrants, migrants arrive in North America. Many of them are travelling on what would later be known as coffin ships. These were overcrowded, undersupplied, and full of disease. And disease that was there spread rapidly. You had thousands dying at sea, and thousands more when they arrive. And this brings us to Grosse Île. This is Canada's famine graveyard. It's just downriver from Quebec City, and this was a quarantine station, a checkpoint between survival and death, if you like. In 1847 alone, around 5,000 Irish men, women and children are buried there. Entire families lost before they ever set foot on the mainland of North America. It becomes known quietly as Canada's famine graveyard. But those who survive, they move inland, like they move into cities like Montreal and Toronto. They don't just arrive quietly, they arrive in massive numbers and they reshape many of these places. In Montreal, the population surges. Fever sheds are built to contain constant outbreak of typhus. In Toronto, Irish migrants become one of the largest communities in the city, working on canals, roads, railways, building the infrastructure of a growing country. They're not small, scattered communities. This is a mass arrival. It's visible, it's concentrated, and it's impossible to ignore. And when people arrive like that, identity is not optional. It's something that you hold onto and brings you together with your fellow immigrant. And you rebuild. You build something that helps you to survive. It could be religion, it could be language, it could be community. In this case, we're looking at sport. The Irish didn't just bring themselves. They brought their instincts and their habits and ways of playing sport. There are accounts of Irish migrants playing hurling in Canada as early as 1830s and the 1840s, and as I said in the intro, especially around Montreal. And they played it somewhere new, not on grass, but on ice. What some would later describe as ice hurley. Same kind of motion and the same kind of rhythm as our famous sport of hurling, but it adapted to frozen rivers and lakes. A game carried across the Atlantic on coffin ships and reshaped by the cold winter of Canada. Some historians suggest that early Canadian hockey may even carry the imprint of these games. Now, to be clear, Acarja, the story of ice hockey isn't one single line or lineage. It's a meeting point of different traditions, different peoples, different ways of playing. Yeah, there are echoes of our game of hurling in it, but hurling's cousin from Scotland, shinty, the Highland game brought by Scottish migrants, that's also there. And really important as well are the indigenous games played on this land, this Canadian land, long before any of that, long before Europeans stick and ball games that already understood movement across ice, across winter, and across space. What I like about this is what emerges in Canada isn't one game replacing another, it's something being formed in between, adapted and shared and claimed as Canadian. And from that world of famine survivors, of, the migrants from Scotland, of Indigenous knowledge, the native Canadians, and the games reshaped by frozen ground, something else begins to take shape. Because by the end of the 19th century, the same communities aren't just surviving anymore. They're organising, they're competing, and they're building clubs, the kind of central theme of some of the last number of episodes on this podcast. And from that meeting point of different games, different traditions, and different peoples, something solid begins to form. Because by the late 19th century, this isn't informal play anymore. It's becoming organised sport. It's structured, it's got competition, it's competitive, and it's public. And at the centre of it all are clubs. Now, it was inevitable with the volume of Irish immigration into the region that Irishness was going to be represented by club at some stage. And in Montreal, when you look back over it, one name stands out: the Montreal Shamrocks. This club was founded in the 1880s, and it really came to prominence in the 1890s. And of course, the name tells you exactly who they are: Shamrock. No translation needed, no adaptation. This is Ireland carried completely and whole across the Atlantic and planted just like a shamrock into this Canadian city. And they're not just like a minor team, they're one of the best. Now, if you're familiar with ice hockey, you'll be familiar with the Stanley Cup. If you're not, the Stanley Cup is the famous prize, the most famous prize of all. So these were Stanley Cup winners in 1899 and again in 1900. They did the double, they did two in a row. At a time when hockey itself was still taking shape, still deciding what it was and who it belonged to, here you have a team that's openly visible Irish, right at the top of it. But the Shamrocks, Montreal Shamrocks that is, they're not just about sport, they're part of something bigger. They're an Irish athletic club, a social space, a network, the kind of place where identity isn't just worn on the jersey, it's lived. Around the club you have community life, events, gatherings, connections. This is how diaspora identity works in practice. It's not abstract and it's not just symbolic, but it's built into everyday life, and that's the same across the globe. And in a city like Montreal, a place shaped by migration, by language and languages, by difference, where being Irish means something, but it doesn't mean everything, the Shamrocks give that form of identity and that visibility, a presence on the ice and a presence in the city. And if we go back to the earlier idea that hockey itself may carry echoes of our older games and older games in general, then there's something deeper happening here, because the Shamrocks aren't just expressing Irish identity through Canadian sport. They may also be participating in shaping that sport in the first place, as part of a wider mix: Irish, Scottish, other immigrants, and the Indigenous, all coming together on the frozen ground. The Shamrocks don't represent all of Montreal or all of Canada, but they do represent something very real in history, a moment when Irish identity is confident enough, visible enough to name itself outward and outright, to compete and to win the Stanley Cup, and to be seen doing it. Now, that kind of visibility doesn't stay the same, because obviously the game, ice hockey in this case, grows, and Canada itself begins to define itself a bit differently, and something starts to shift. The name change, the symbols evolve. And in Toronto, where we're going next, you can see that shift happening in real time, from Shamrocks to something else entirely. Next to Carja, we go to a city I'm familiar with myself, Toronto. And in Toronto, you see shifts happening in real time. By the mid 19th century, Toronto is in many ways an Irish city. In the decades that followed An Gorta Mór, the Great Hunger, Irish migrants arrive in huge numbers. To give you an indication of how big this movement was, by the 1850s and the 1860s, people of Irish birth or descent made up around a third of the population, sometimes more. But that Irishness is not unified. It's divided, and it's divided sharply, something we're familiar with sometimes here at home. And it's divided publicly and sometimes violently. Because believe it or not, in Toronto, it became a stronghold or a strong centre of the Orange Order outside of Ireland. Now, if you're familiar with the Orange Order, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. If you're not, this was a Protestant unionist organisation, exclusively Protestant, sectarian. It was defined by its opposition to Catholicism and Catholics, and it was rooted in the same sectarian divisions that the British implanted into Ireland to aid its colonisation efforts. And in Toronto, it doesn't just exist for a while, for a time at least, it dominated. Through the late 19th century and early 20th centuries, the Orange Order held enormous influence over civic life in Toronto. Historians estimate that roughly 3/4 of Toronto's mayors between the mid-19th century and the 1950s were members of the Orange Order. And that's incredible. Its reach extends, of course, if you've got a situation like that, it extends into the police force, into government, into structures of everyday power. And they're visible. You have Orange Order parades, especially on the 12th of July, and these aren't celebrations, these are displays of dominance. They're public, they're visible, and for Irish Catholics, they're unavoidable. And for Irish Catholic migrants, many of them famine survivors or their children, this shapes a lot of what they experience in those years because they're not arriving into a neutral city. They're arriving into one where Irish identity already exists, but not on their terms. And they face barriers that echo the experience of Irish Catholic population in the occupied 6 counties, in jobs, in housing, in political representation. But their response is to build their own world alongside of it. Churches, schools, neighbourhoods, and like everywhere else, clubs. The Toronto St. Patrick's, or the Toronto St. Pats, are founded in 1919. Now, they take over from an earlier existing hockey club, originally called the Toronto Hockey Club. But the name carries weight. This is heritage, its identity, and it's stated clearly. St. Patrick, the patron saint of Ireland, a name that speaks directly to the city's Irish population. And it's a way of marking presence in a city where that presence is contested. And if the Orange Order are in political power to an extent, this team wears green. The symbolism is unmistakable, and this is important because it's no longer just a local club, it's a franchise. It's part of the early National Hockey League, NHL. More a commercial, more centralised form of sport, but it still holds that identity and it signals and shows belonging. Now, just like the Shamrocks before them, they're not on the margins because in 1922, the Toronto St. Patrick's won the Stanley Cup. The biggest prize in Canadian hockey, an Irish identity, and it's at the centre of the national game. But according to something interesting happens here. In 1927, something changes. There's a shift. The team is purchased by Conn Smythe, and with that comes a new name. And one that's familiar up until today, because Toronto St. Patrick's become the Maple Leafs. It's an important change. It reflects something that's probably bigger than sport, and it's a move away from identities and move towards franchises. Now, there's a contrast here between Toronto St. Patrick's fading away and being replaced by the Maple Leaf and replaced by the Maple Leafs, with what tended to happen, for example, in Scotland, where the identities of Celtic and Hibernian remained and lived on. But it is noteworthy to look at something that's so famous like the Maple Leafs and see that within the growth of the Maple Leafs and before the Maple Leafs existed, the root, if you like, was Toronto St. Patrick's. Now, Accordia, if I could indulge myself for a moment, I mentioned Toronto is a city I'm a little bit familiar with. It's not abstract history, it's something I've felt myself. I spent a summer working in Toronto in 2005. I was working on the waterfront and just a short walk from a place called Irish or Ireland Park. It sits right on the waterfront looking down over Lake Ontario. And it's not far from where many Irish migrants would have first set foot in the city in the 19th century. And about 2 years after I left, a park was officially opened up, so 2007. But even before that, the space carried the memory. It was built as a counterpart to the famine memorial at Grosse Île, a kind of bookend to that journey. One marking where so many people died, and the other marking where some survived and arrived. And there are amazing sculptures in this place. The sculptures are based on those at the Famine Memorial in Dublin. So there's a link back to Dublin as well. In Dublin, the figures are gaunt, starving, and leaving the city or leaving Ireland. In Toronto, they're different. They're still worn and they're still marked by what they've come through, but they're standing a little bit more upright. They're carrying something forward. They're facing a new place. And when you look at it and when you imagine what it was like, that kind of image stays with you. Because you're standing in a modern city, the CN Tower looking down on you. Modern glass towers, traffic, noise. And right there at the edge of it is this reminder that this city, in part at least, was built by people who arrived with nothing. People who had to remake themselves here. And at that time, I didn't fully grasp it back in 2005. But looking back on it now, knowing what Toronto was like in the 19th century, knowing the experiences or imagining the experiences of those who travelled across the Atlantic in search of a new life and in search of salvation and in search of escaping basically a genocidal Gorta Mór, the genocidal Great Hunger at home. You put a certain value on the work that those people did when they arrived into the city. And it changes how you see not just your own country, it changes how you see the world and world history. And it can even change how you look at something as simple as the name of a sporting organisation. And so Accordia, from famine ships to frozen rivers, from shamrocks to maple leaves, and to the Greencaps over on the Pacific coast. Irish identity doesn't stand still. It moves and it adapts, it changes shape depending on where it finds itself, and sometimes it holds tightly to memory. Sometimes it listens to the place around it, and sometimes it finds a new way of belonging. If you've enjoyed this episode of Accordia of Undercover Irish, I'd really appreciate if you could take a moment to leave a review, drop a comment, click the like button or to subscribe wherever you're listening. It genuinely helps people find the podcast and helps with the algorithm. And it helps keep this storytelling style going forward. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on this one, Accordia. Especially if you've come across an Irish name, an Irish club name that's unusual. Do they look back to Ireland? Do they, like the Greencaps, start to reflect something new? And Accordia, if you want to support the podcast, you'll find me over on Patreon. Just look up Undercover Irish. It's somewhere where you can support the work of the podcast for the price of a cup of coffee every month. And it helps to keep this podcast, Undercover Irish, going. And Corja, if you haven't already, and this is the kind of episode you enjoy, have a look back at some of the other episodes I've done where I look at Irish identity in the form of sporting organisations, both at home and abroad. It's part of the same story, it's just told in different places. Corja sin a bhfuil, once again, thank you so much for listening. Fanigi slán, stay safe. Berigi bua mo Corja, slán go fóill.